This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm 47, so it's no magic. I had some years, so that was a very nice introduction. I appreciated it. So I slightly changed my title. I changed it just to add the cyber deception to the title. Because we do study deception and aging more broadly in the lab. Lab is one line of our research. But today I will specifically talk about the online deception aspects of the work. But we have different scenarios where we study how and why might older adults be particularly susceptible to deception online for tonight. And I like to start my talks. I mean, I'm a psychologist by training, cognitive and social cognitive psychologist, but I was trained at the Max Planck Institute in Germany on lifespan development. So really the idea that we change across the entire lifespan that we have, including in aging. And so I like to start my talks by showing this slide that just re-emphasizes the importance of studying older individuals. And that is really, if you look at, it's actually not doing the pointer, sorry. It's just doing the mouse, it's not, but it's fine, you guys can see the mouse here, right? Yeah. Okay, so this is census data developing over the years, and you can see that it's really the older individuals that are the fastest growing segment in our population, and that's true for industrialized nations throughout the world. And especially even the category 80 years and older individuals. I mean, we have a dramatically growing number of people in our society. So it's very important to understand what happens in aging, with a specific focus, in my view, on how can we make the aging process better? How can we keep people happier and more independent longer so they can have a really good life for themselves, but also be, important members and continue to be important members for society. The specific framework that we use in my lab to study aging is one very basic principle in lifespan psychological research that is of a changing gain-loss ratio across the lifespan. So if you look at this chart, at this graph here, you have the lifespan down here, and you see that, and you probably have all experienced this, younger in your lives, there's lots of positive developments, lots of new things you learn. We learn to walk, to talk, to interact more extensively, having more friends as we're younger, and all that. As we move through life, losses start kicking in, and later in life, typically the ratio is a little bit less beneficial with more losses than gains that we experience. However, what I do want to point out, and we study primarily in my lab, is this still existing good amount of potential for gains. So even late in life, there's potential to get better at things, and there's things that, they're not so good earlier on, they only start becoming better in older age. And this is true for different domains in life, functional domains, physical functioning, cognition, as well as what I mostly focus on is social life and emotional affective processes, how we're feeling about ourselves, our other people around us, and how we interact with other people. So this is sort of just to give you a little bit of broader sort of umbrella of what we are interested in the lab is understanding aging and trying to help older adults to lead a better life longer. And as I said, there clearly is a bright side in aging, cognitively and socioemotionally. There's a lot of good things that happen. There's evidence that, for example, we become better at regulating our emotions. Maybe our systems are not hiking up quite as much about every little thing. Often social relationships become more intense, maybe fewer of them, but more intense in nature. Older adults also, even though they experience physical and cognitive decline, often report higher well-being. When you ask them, how do you feel? It's actually higher scores that you get than if you ask younger adults. So there clearly is a bright side of aging. However, there's also a dark side of some of these, what seems like, in some regards, positive changes, cognitive and socio-emotional changes in aging. And I want to focus a little bit more on those in the context of a quite relevant real-world applicable field, that of deception. And this can come in very different forms. It can be financial exploitation, phishing, misinformation, fake news, and we study different aspects of it. And I'm just going to focus on some of the studies that we're doing in the context. But really the idea that some of the changes we go through naturally as we age might be beneficial, but some of them might also lead to something that make us maybe more vulnerable to deception, for example. That's kind of the point I want to make here. So for this line of research in my lab, we are, so to say, adopting an aging perspective to the science of decision making. So we're taking a closer look at the aging decision maker in the online realm, if you will. And why do we do this? Well, older adults make up only 20% of the US population, but they control over half of the financial wealth. As we all see every single day in our lives, they often hold very important positions of power and make very important decisions financially, health-wise and politically for this whole nation and the world, but also, of course, every individual in their own life. And financial exploitation is actually among the most common forms of elder abuse. So trying to understand susceptibility for deception in aging is very important for society, and it's very important for the individual in society as well. So why may there be an increased susceptibility to deception and exploitation in aging? And I do have to say, the literature is not totally clear on this. There's definitely some studies suggesting older adults are less prone to deception. They might be actually more careful. They have more experience. You know, they might just look closer than some younger adults do. But there's also good reasons to assume that they do have some difficulties in decision-making that might make them more at risk for deception and exploitation and fraud. And, you know, I'm using some of these terms quite interchangeably tonight. And one of those is coming from very basic cognitive aging research, a very robust finding over the last 30 or something years, that of age-related changes in what we call fluid and crystallized cognition. And I do want to make this a tiny test here, if I may. Anyone, is any one of you familiar with those two constructs, crystallized versus fluid intelligent? Anyone knows? Have you heard those two terms before? You know what those are? Nope. It's similar when I ask in a class at UF, they also would not know, even they heard it the week before or whatever. It's possible they would say, no, we haven't heard this. Okay, so let me tell you what it is. So here you actually see a chart across the lifespan, young, middle-aged, older adults. Crystallized intelligence is something that we found out over the years actually increases with age. So older adults are better at crystallized intelligence than younger adults. It's something like fact knowledge, for example. Older adults have a lot of experience, so they do, it's easier for them to integrate new concepts, new terms, because they already have a wealth of knowledge. So crystallized intelligence, if you will, is fact knowledge. Whereas fluid, you see this declining here over the course of the lifetime, is something like how fast we have to process something. You know, we often only have very few seconds or minutes time to process information, how much information we can hold in our head at the same time, how well we can integrate the information. That's all called fluid intelligence, and that declines. So you see, depending on the cognitive function, huge differences in whether older adults would be at an advantage or a disadvantage. If we apply this to a decision-making context, what you basically see here is that if the decision is fluid in nature, so has to be done on the spot, quick, lots of information, you see that older adults don't fare very well. This is the older adults here compared to the young adults or the middle adults, somewhere in between. This is based on some previous research. However, if the decision requires a lot of previous experience, lots of fact knowledge that you have to have acquired beforehand, older adults do pretty well. They even outperform often middle-aged and younger adults. And if you, just as a little side note, if you look at the middle-aged adults, they're often termed as in their golden age of decision-making because they're still high in crystallized cognition, and they are also high, or they are already high in crystallized, and they're still high in fluid. So for a lot of decision-making contexts, that's ideal to be middle-aged. So that's a good news also about middle-aged. But what is important to understand is that many decisions in everyday life are fluid in nature. We have to decide very quickly, are we gonna, click on this phishing link, and I'm just foreshadowing something we will be talking about more. Am I gonna click on this now or not, So older adults can easily be at a disadvantage because of this age-related change in crystallized versus fluid, and specifically decline in fluid cognition with age. There is another reason why older adults might be particularly susceptible to deception, and that is what we coin age-related reduced sensitivity to negative arousing cues or arousal cues. So for example, just to give you one study that was done to showcase this, but there's a pretty broad literature at this point speaking to this phenomenon. A study where young and old adults were presented with faces that varied in facial trustworthiness. And what was found is that older adults showed reduced activity in an area called insula. It's part of the cortex, slightly subcortical area. They showed reduced activity in that region to untrustworthy faces. So if a face showed signs, cues of untrustworthiness, the older adult's insula did not pick up on those cues as well as the younger adult's insula. Insula is a very important region in integrating what we often call gut feelings with external stimuli. So, something that I see and I'm trying to make sense of, and it creates some sort of feeling in my body, that all of those inputs are kind of integrated in the insula. So very important region if you think about deception, right? You have something coming from the outside, some signals from the inside. And this region is not working as well in response to cues of untrustworthiness in faces in older than young adults. So they have less arousal to this type of negative information, less warning in a way in their system, in their brains. This is just another study basically making the same point. It's an economic game people play. And what was found is that when it comes to losing money, so anticipation of now I'm going to lose $5, in young adults, you get nice insular activation to this. Their insula doesn't like this. It's a negative experience. They get aroused. They don't like this. Older adults show no loss anticipation signals in their insula. Just another example of a study that showed this reduced negative arousal cueing in the older adult brain. Third point I wanted to make, why older adults might be more at risk for deception. It's another brain study, a very neat one. I like this a lot. It's a collaborator of mine, Nathan Spreng, in Montreal, who did that study with another colleague, Gary Turner, a few years ago, where they identified individuals, older adults, in the community who had been previously exploited in their real life, so verified, financially exploited individuals. And they put them in the fMRI scanner, structural and functional imaging, and they actually also had an age-matched group of older individuals who had not been previously financially exploited. Maybe there had been attempts, but they had not fallen for something. And they compared these two groups, so the vulnerable population that had previously been exploited of older adults versus the ones that had sort of withstood this fraud. And what they found, again going back to our insula that you guys have already heard about, they found that in the financially exploited older individuals, the size of this important region that might help us to pick up on detection was actually smaller. So there was less cortical thickness measured for the insula. And also another region, but I'm not going to go into that. Also, what they found in that study was the previously financially exploited older individuals also had a less good communication between different networks in their brain. So you want networks in the brain within that network to communicate really well. So you want like a lot of activity there. And you don't want that network necessarily communicate so much with another network. It depends a little bit on the task, but this was how it was defined here. But what they found is the financially exploited older individuals had less good, if you will, communication in two networks that they looked at specifically, and they had more noise. These networks talked more between each other and with other networks. So just a less good, if you will, brain network connectivity among the financially exploited compared to the not previously exploited older individuals. Okay, so just to give you some reasons for why when we went into the research that I'm going to tell you more about now in our own lab, when we went into this research, why we went into it thinking, or with a prediction, with a hypothesis that older adults would be particularly susceptible to deception. And we got particularly interested in online deception, cyber deception, and specifically phishing in our early studies. We got interested in this because we increasingly all use the internet all the time for everything, including older individuals do that. I think COVID just gave another huge push for this, right? We got so technologically savvy now with all of this, but also all of this kind of, even like all the phishing and other deception kind of attempts also dramatically increased during COVID. And so we thought this is a really important topic to study in older adults, online deception in aging, given this vulnerability in their decision-making process, potentially at work. So what we did is, we didn't just want to ask people, because when you ask people, they tell you one thing, but they really do another thing, right? And most of the phishing research, when we started this 4 or 5 years ago, was about just asking people, would you do this? No, never would do this. So we came up with something, we call it the Phishing Internet Task, FIT task, that allows us to actually measure behavior, measure susceptibility in behavior. What we do, and I'm not going to go into detail here, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview. We basically send phishing messages unbeknownst to our participants. Here's just a number of one of the studies. We have different studies where we do this. Participants receive those in their personal email accounts. Those emails, I'll show you an example in just a minute, have a link. It's all under our control, nothing dangerous. It's all like we have control over the landing page, over the website, that if you click the link, you land on a website. We control that website, nothing happens, but we can measure who opens an email, who clicks on the link, and who maybe even submits some information on that website. We're not recording what they submit, but we can measure whether they went even a step further and submit some information. So we call this phishing in the wild, because it's literally in your email account, right? In everyday life, when in one of those studies. Just a little side note, it's a very involved data collection infrastructure. We have a lot of undergrad students and grad students sitting there and actually constantly interacting with our own simulated phishing emails, because if you don't, and accounts, we have to, for example, find out, are they being filtered? Are the emails being filtered by, Gmail or whatever filters a lot of emails out, unfortunately, and we have to replace emails if they get filtered out and people never see them. We cannot measure susceptibility if your filter already did a great job not even displaying it to you, right? So we have a lot of people in the background communicating with accounts, checking filters, and also sending emails to different accounts and so on. So very involved infrastructure, but very neat and unique, because we can get at actual behavior in everyday life in terms of susceptibility to phishing. So this is an example of a simulated phishing email. We personalize them, so there would be the participant's name, has some sort of subject line, participant's name, always some sort of text, and then a link. And that's what I told you before. We can measure, they click the link, they land on a website, they do more activities on the website. Many of those emails come to participants during the course of the data collection. And I was shocked when this is a study we have already published. We have an ongoing study happening right now as well, where we replicate some of these findings. I thought this would never work. Who clicks on this, 43% of we had young and older adults in this study. 43% of individuals, almost half of the sample, clicked at least on one email. One email is enough sometimes to download something onto your computer, that then is connected to other computers, and you have the infection right there. Some people clicked more than once. There was also a good amount of people who never clicked, but I was really shocked when I saw this. I also just anecdotally like to mention that as we were piloting the study, I had seen all the phishing emails. We were piloting it among ourselves before we launched the big first study on it. And I was sitting at home, and I got this email about a neighbor of mine for like a neighborhood, I don't remember, like network or something they wanted to start. I'm like, who's this new neighbor who wants it? And then I realized shortly after, it's one of our emails. So I have to say those emails are very good. And when we started this research, maybe they were better than the real emails, but those are picking up. Like, scammers are getting better and better with their deceptions as we go. So nowadays, these emails are not particularly good. I mean, they're good, but the real scams are just as good. Okay, but I told you I'm interested in aging and would like to show you a little bit of aging data. So this is now broken, the data you just saw, the 43%, we're breaking them down into young women, young men, older women, and older men. And we didn't just find a plain age effect, actually. We found that it was the older women in our sample who were particularly vulnerable to the phishing, email phishing intervention. And there is a lot of speculation what this could be now. We're actually right now doing a big data collection to get a little bit more of an idea of what is it. It's not gender and it's not age per se. It's something that comes with that explains the susceptibility. And we have to understand what is it. What is this susceptibility profile that leads to this? But before I go a little bit more into this, let me also say that the emails we sent, they fell into different categories. And I'm just going to talk about one of those, which we call weapons of influence. Weapons of influence are techniques of influencing people to do a behavior that might go against their own best interests. And there's different principles, 7, some people say, some researchers say, there might be others too, but 7 primary ones. I introduced 3 to you. One is authority. I'm sure you've gotten emails that claim it comes from a medical person or it comes from the IT department and really needs you to change your password. You got to do this, or something bad will happen. So that's authority. The principle of authority, you might fall for this because it's authority. Scarcity is another one I'm sure you've seen also in consumer, situations where you buy something. It's only available now. This coin collection from the 50s, we only have 2 left. Tomorrow they'll be both gone and before, so you better buy it now. Click now on this link to buy it. Reciprocation is another one where, you would get like a free weekend on the beach. The least you can do is click on this attachment and look at the company's profile or something like this, right? They give you something nice, you give something nice back, and there you go, your computer is infected because you clicked on an attachment or on a link. So our emails fell into these different categories, the way we had phrased the text in there. And we were interested not only what are the most effective weapons, which you can see here, scarcity and authority, but when you now look at young adults in black here and older adults in gray, there was differences between the age group as to which weapons were most effective. So for young adults, it was scarcity was most effective, more effective than for older adults. For older adults, it was reciprocation and liking, way more effective than it was among young adults. And this actually fits very nicely with a theory in aging research that older adults pay a lot of attention to social scenarios. They're very in tune with social relationships. They care a lot about social life. Young adults do too, but this really fits nicely. Reciprocation and liking. Liking is you like something, I like the same thing. You love pets, I do too. I'll click on the link for the pet cruelty, anti-pet cruelty, you know, a link or whatever it is. So fits very nicely with developmental aging theory on socioemotional changes with age. This one I also love, and I never thought it would work out that well. But what we found was when we asked people, and I told you, we didn't want to ask people, okay? So we came up with a behavioral paradigm. But nevertheless, we asked them at the end. Before we had told them there are phishing emails we send to you and all that, they had no idea yet. We presented them in the lab some emails that looked just like the ones they had gotten during the intervention at home. Were not identical, but the same nature. And we asked them, would you click on something like this? So really just self-report. And 1 would be no, would never click on this. 5 would be, yeah, absolutely would click on this. You can already see young and older adults, no, would never do this. But you saw 43% of our sample actually had clicked, right? And older adults, even more likely to say no. Across all of those different weapons, no, wouldn't click on this, even more than the younger adults. So really potentially, particularly at risk because very low awareness of the risk, which is often the first step. At least you need to know you have to do something about it because you are at risk. Okay. What I said earlier is it's not age, it's not sex, it's something that comes with those demographics that explains why there might be this vulnerability. So what we did is, it's the same sample that you saw now on these other data slides. We kept the young adults, the age range was 18 to 37, but we divided up the older adults. There is a lot of literature in aging that you can't just throw everyone into one pot. You have to look very closely. A 60-year-old is not the same as a even 65-year-old, as a 70, definitely not as the same as 80, and of course there's inter-individual differences anyways, but we often find aging-related decline patterns way more pronounced the older people get. So a huge difference often between a 65 and an 85-year-old. And so that's why we divided our sample in young, old, and I call them old, but the reviewer made us call them middle old because they're really not old. I don't know what they have to be 100 or something to be old. So we were, but these are the oldest individuals in our sample. And we looked at their cognition in a completely unrelated task. So how good is their cognitive functioning in tasks in the lab? And what we found, it was the oldest old in our sample. If their cognition was low, which is this end of the scale here, is low cognition in a memory type of task, that's the individuals who were most susceptible to our phishing intervention. So they were the ones who clicked most likely on the emails. So it's associated with age, but it's not necessarily age per se. It's something that most typically comes with age, not for everyone. But it seems having good cognition helps and makes sense, right? Your decision-making might still be better. You're inspecting information more closely. It might help with this kind of deceptive, not to fall for this deceptive scenario, or for these deceptions. And very similar, I'm not going to go into much detail here, but very, very similar pattern for affect. Those oldest old individuals in our sample who had negative affective profiles, so that's referring to mood, not a lot of positive mood, not a lot of good feelings, were most susceptible to the phishing attacks. So nice evidence that cognition and affect, mood matter, according to this data, in maybe being less vulnerable to some deception that might come our way online as we age, and before as well. This is just a super quick note. And if you're interested, you can also go on my website at UF. We have also launched this similar type of research into other domains of deception, fake news. We got especially intrigued by this during the COVID pandemic, is when we started this. We had to do everything online, and this was research we could relatively easily do online, and also on conspiracy theories. And we actually find very similar findings in terms of these cognitive and affective profiles when it comes to the ability to detect what is a fake news versus not. Again, it's cognition matters, affect matters, in very old individuals. And that's when they become less able to figure out, is this fake news or not, when they're confronted with real fake news and real news. Okay, I want to go back quickly to the the phishing internet task, and also point out that we have an extended feature here, which we introduced only in a more recent study. We did not only send out emails, but we also sent out text messages. You probably realized this on your own phones. 10 years ago, got no scam stuff on my phone, and now all the time, right? This is a new way of phishing, not so new now anymore, but like a newer way of phishing that we need to understand too. Are we seeing the same vulnerabilities here, or is it different? So we introduced this, this smishing, so-called smishing. So during the course of the intervention on 6 days, again, unbeknownst to participants, they received text messages, same structure as you saw. I'll show you an example. And we also called participants. I'm sure you guys got many of those phone calls in your life already. Somebody trying to, get you to tell your credit card information and all sorts of other nice things. So here's an example for smishing. Text was sending out, very similar structure. Important again is the link. We can measure who clicks on the link, goes to a website. People do stuff on the website. We can measure that. In phishing, I'm not expecting you to be able to read this, but we have a very standardized protocol on the phone. Our RAs in the phone, they call people up, and then we measure how far people go. Do they even pick up? Do they immediately hang up when they realize what this is? Do they volunteer their name? Do they volunteer mail address? And so on and so forth. Do they even call us back? Because we tell them, in order to redeem this, and there is people who go all the way. And I just quickly, this is data that's still being collected, so this is preliminary. I didn't run statistics on this, but you can again see young adults in black, older adults in white here. It is, again, some indication that older adults are more susceptible to the text message type of phishing, so they are less likely than the younger adults. Less likely than the younger adults to not click on any of those text message links. They're more likely to click on one. So older adults, more susceptibility to smishing, and phishing, same pattern here too. There's, on all the different levels, older adults are less likely to never answer or return the call. They're more likely to answer it. They are more likely to provide personal information and more likely to call back. Most of the people hang up, I have to say. This one takes a lot of phone calls to get some data because we're so used to it, right? We just immediately hang up. Okay. You can probably already tell, also from me, sort of getting agitated and excited, how much work this behavioral assessment of phishing susceptibility is. It's a lot of monitoring, a lot of work. We wanted to come up with something we can do more quickly in the lab in a more controlled way. So we developed a task that we call PEST, and it allows us to measure phishing susceptibility in the lab. And what is nice, I'll tell you in a second what this measure is about super quickly, but what I want to say right away is it highly correlates with the phishing in the wild. So it's pretty much the people who are susceptible in the wild, what I told you before, the fit, is also the people who are performing not so well in the in-lab task. So that was really good news for us, because now maybe not always we have to do this behavioral intervention if we have an in-lab task that gives us the same or similar data, not the same. This is a task where sounds a little bit artificial, but as I said, it seems to correlate nicely with the real-world behavior. You get emails. Your task is to sort the emails, not to sort them, but to basically look at them and decide whether they are safe, definitely or possibly, or suspicious. So simply say, is there something fishy about those? And some of them are real emails. We know they're real emails, genuine emails. We drew all of this from the net. Sorry, this font is a little bit small, but here there are some real phishing emails. We know they are phishing emails. We got them from IT departments and other things. And we also simulated some. It's less relevant in the context of this talk, while we also wanted some real ones and some simulated ones, that are made up, basically. But again, what we find is that older adults, Here you have a chronological age range. This was a group of older adults, 65 older adults that ranged from 54 to 83. Over the course of older age, the ability to say whether something is a benign or a malicious email in this in-lab controlled task declined. So older adults were less good at figuring out if this is a suspicious, potentially dangerous email the older they got. We took this a step further. I'm sure you have heard about the ApoE and the ApoE4 carriers in particular. It's one of those genetic risk factors that risk factor, meaning it might put people at a greater risk of developing dementia and Alzheimer's disease down the road if they are carriers of this ApoE4 allele. So we had older adults, we measured, we did assays and we found out if they're ApoE4 carriers, so high-risk population of older individuals. And they also did the PEST task, this in-lab controlled phishing discrimination task. And what we found is that the people who are carriers of this Alzheimer's disease risk gene modification are less good at figuring out whether an email is safe or not safe. And especially when they are low in cognitive functioning. So it's again coming back that if you're older, if your cognition is not so good anymore, and here in this case, if you are at higher genetic risk for developing further decline down the road, our measure basically picks up on this. So we would be able to predict that you perform lower in this task. We're even right now thinking, can we take this a step further and make it a diagnostic tool? Because a lot of the tools for dementia, they are very artificial, they're not real-life performance. I mean, some of them are. But this would be a nice deception-related real-life task, close enough to real-life decisions we make with emails, that would maybe even work as a predictor. But it's still a long way until we can say something like this. Okay, let me summarize the findings as I have them so far, and then I tell you a little bit where we're moving with this in the future. So we were able to develop behavior-based measures, ecologically valid, meaning they measure something that is pretty close to real-life behavior. One of them is actually in real life, and then the other one highly correlated, something we can do in the lab to measure online deception, susceptibility to online deception in aging. We find that older adults, especially older women, are very susceptible to these phishing attacks, to the online deception. And especially when cognition is low, affective profiles are not so beneficial, and when there is a potential genetic risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. What we take from this is that if we now want to move forward and develop tools and techniques that help with the decision-making process in aging, when it comes to these decisions of is something deceptive or not, should I do this or not, we need to take a one-size-does-not-fit-all type of approach. Because as you can tell, the intervention didn't work the same way for everyone. It was certain populations with certain characteristics that struggled most, right? So if we do a training that's just the same for everyone, it might be very non-useful for some people. It might be very useful for others. So we really want to take a more personalized anti-phishing defense solution approach in our way forward. And right now, we are in the context of collecting some larger scale data, similar to what you've seen before, but going a lot steps further, covering some vulnerability profiles. And specifically what we look at, like pretty extensive assessment of cognition. In these studies I showed you, it was just one or two short cognitive measures. Now we do a battery of cognitive tests. We want to understand what type of cognition might be particularly important to maintain in order to avoid susceptibility. What type of socioemotional measures or functions, do we want to make sure we understand are still intact because they're helpful, like, including things like loneliness, how well you can read other people's emotions, how much social contact you have, how well you can regulate your emotions. All these could be factors that are contributing. We heard mood matters, right? So there's other socioemotional functions that might be beneficial if we want to understand susceptibility in aging better. And we also measure brain health. So we have in this ongoing data collection, there's fMRI scanning, as well as structural MRI, where we try to understand, you remember those earlier studies with the insula I showed you, we want to also get measures of our participants in terms of size of certain regions in their brain and function of networks and regions in their brain. All of these being potential predictors to the poor decision-making that we have now shown in this first study. So we're just wrapping up data collection actually on this, and we'll have a lot more answers about the profiles that make up for this susceptibility in aging, not just those few data points that you saw at this point. And we want to take that information, and that's where I would love to start working more with people here at the Institute. We want to take that information that we learn about the individual, the decision maker, to implement on-the-spot warning. So basically, once we know who's at particular risk and what does this risk profile look like, what are the weapons of influence that work particularly well with certain groups, with certain individuals, what's their cognitive profile, their affective profile. And we have the message that's deceptive, right? And the message has certain cues. It uses certain weapons. It might be, I haven't mentioned some of those other features, but it uses some familiar business, for example, so familiarity could be a factor in the messages. We want to sort of take the characteristics of the deceptive message and the profile we know about the people who are confronted with these messages. And we want to develop something, we're thinking about maybe calling it Merlin as a little advisor as you're working your way through your daily email. There's somebody who gives you warning on the spot. But it wouldn't warn you if you're not someone who is at high risk of clicking on a certain type of email. That email maybe doesn't have ingredients that do it for you. It wouldn't give you the warning. Only, do you know what I mean? It's really personalized, basically. If it is something that would really trigger something in you according to your profile and the type of message characteristics, you would maybe get more warnings, and you would get less if it's something that's not a dangerous type of, or not very likely, very misleading type of message for you. So that's going to be the future music of this research, to implement this more into some decision supportive tool. I also wanted to mention, because this is a relatively new grant, I just wanted to point this out, the research that you learned about in this presentation, we're currently launching it actually in Orlando and also in Miami, and some of it in Gainesville as well, into a more diverse population of older individuals. So these are people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, as well as individuals with mild cognitive impairments, so they already have earlier forms of cognitive decline. And we want to do something very similar to what you saw, but this is a particularly understudied and particularly at-risk population, and we know close to nothing about their susceptibility to deception. And this grant really tries to come up with like a short predictive toolkit to identify people at risk in these populations. And we're working very closely with elder abuse lawyers, people who work in big living communities, CEOs of big living communities and staff there, and nurses, people who interact with older adults on the base to find out the best way to implement some of the tools that we're developing in this research. And then I want to end with another big grant we just got, and I'm very excited about, and I'm not going to go into detail. This is a very complex figure, and I'm not expecting you to see any of it too clearly, but it's taking the research that I was talking about a step further in trying to understand, not only describing, like you hear me talk about, these are the groups that are susceptible, and this is more a description almost at this point, what we've done so far. This new grant will try to understand better the process of deception. How do we learn to trust someone? How do we learn to not trust someone? Where in the process are we getting cautious? How does our body, our brain, how do they signal us, now something is too much, this is dangerous, I shouldn't believe this anymore, I shouldn't do this anymore, this was a piece too much of information, now I get it, I'm pulling out. Or I'm going back in because now this person convinced me again, this is a good idea, right? It's a dynamic process where we might pull out and go back in depending on what happens. So we want to get a better idea of that process in this grant. And it just started, it's a 5-year grant, so we have a lot of time, and we'll do a bunch of studies in the next years related to this. And all of this, and this is my concluding slide, is towards trying to improve the gain-loss ratio across the adult lifespan. So I want to bring you back to this big picture, and this is just one line of research in which we try to understand the decision-making process in aging and then coming up with, not just describing it, but also down the road coming up with ways of helping to make, for example, decision-making in this context better. Developing some tools, or at least with understanding and then training and communicating the information we have acquired in our research, helping individuals to have more gains late in their lives. And I end with acknowledgement slides. I really would like to thank you for listening to all of this. And there's a lot of people involved. I have an awesome lab group at UF. We have very good staff at the McKnight Brain Institute for all the brain work that we do. And then there's a lot of collaborators, international and national, involved in this research. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Natalie. Mm-hmm. I'm sure we have some questions in the crowd, so I'm going to get this to you. Hi, Jose. How are you?
Thank you. Nice presentation.
Thank you.
I'm a neurologist, and I work with a lot of patients with dementia, mild cognitive impairment. I have many patients through the years that have been subjects of scams. So an interesting feature that we notice on them is that once they are even gently confronted about the fact that they were victims of scam, they have trouble acknowledging and realizing that there was a problem. And they know they lose the money, they know somebody contact them and they contact them back. So is that part of the problem on the insular cortex that continue that behavior, or what's, because one thing is fall into a scam, and there's another process which is not understanding that what you did was something wrong, even though you're confronted with the data.
Yeah, I think it could have many different explanations. So one could be memory. Do they even remember? And do they remember, I was having a conversation earlier with someone about this as well. Sometimes we remember the content of something, but we don't remember where the information is coming from. So maybe they remember something of it, but they don't remember it was from a deceptive source, for example. So it could be a memory problem. Another answer I want to give to this, or not answer, just a reflection about this. A couple years ago, I read a really interesting, I think it was a New York Times article about a woman who had been extensively scammed over many years of her old age life. And she loved the scammer. She was entirely clear about, maybe you guys, some of you read that too, she was entirely clear about that he is abusing her, but he was one of the few people who made her feel needed. He told her, and she was very needed in earlier years in her life. She had a job where she had control over things and made important decisions. She became older. Nobody really took her not as serious anymore as she needed for her personality and so on. And there comes this scammer who clearly does something bad, and she holds on to it. So it could be, one could be cognitive, one other explanation could be more socioemotional, personality related. There's probably a lot of different reasons, a lot of different scenarios, and a lot of different factors playing in at the same time. But yeah, I appreciate you bringing this up.
I'm going to toss this to you, okay?
Awesome. Thank you. So you were talking about how crystallized cognition increases as you get older. I was wondering, how would the younger generation who grew up with the internet, knowing nothing but it, would that experience make them less susceptible to scams?
It's a very good question too, and I have never studied adolescents or younger in my research, but with this research topic, I would love to actually study even younger age group. I mean, in our samples, there is the 18 and older, and many of them still fall, and they're very savvy, But the question is what happens in adolescence. With our paradigm, we haven't launched it into that. But you could, I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, I was more focused on as when they get older.
Oh, as they get older.
Yeah, so,
yes, that's a good point too. So one thing I wanted, so there is clearly, we differentiate age effects from cohort effects, and you're basically referring to a cohort effect. So an age effect would be just with increasing age, something happens, or doesn't happen. Cohort is a now 60-year-old is not the same as somebody who's now 20 and will be 60 in 40 years, right? There's cohort differences. We go through different things throughout life. We have different experiences. We grow up with different things. It's not the same. To tease those two apart, you have to do longitudinal research. You have to follow people over time. You've seen in my studies, it's a snapshot of young adults, snapshot of older. I'm comparing them. I don't know, is it cohort differences or is it age? So I have to follow people over time, and I have to live really, really long as an individual. There's big studies where like group of researchers are doing this together and follow people over many years. So we will have data along those lines down the road. We have not seen a whole lot of indication, a little bit in the misinformation, fake news research, we have seen some indication that the amount that you deal with news, kind of as a proxy for how savvy you might be with it, is actually not helpful in detection of fake news. But it could be that under some instances, being more tech savvy helps, and maybe under some it might you even make you even more careless. And if I look at my daughters, they're 14 and 17, I don't think they've gotten very good training in what to believe on the internet and what not. And I really have to blame myself for it. I don't have enough time to always check it. And I don't know it myself either, but they are questioning this way less than I would. They're not looking at the source. And I'm not going to show them the recording of this talk because they'll get angry if I say this. It's not true. It is true. So I think there's a lot of different age and cohort, very interesting things we could look into and try to understand better. Good question.
In your sample group, did you factor in, for these older adults, their life experience, education, mental health, their cultural experience? Because, for example, I'm from New York, and in grade school we became street smart about scams and someone bullying you, and and I'm 76 now, and I'm very suspicious about emails, telephone calls. I don't open them. I figure if someone want to get hold of me, and if I owe someone money, they'll get a hold of me. So my question is, how much of a factor does that play into your study's conclusions?
So it's also a very good question. So education, we usually have some information, how many years of education, whatever that means. People could have 15 years and they didn't go past their first semester in terms of content, but we do usually add this. In Germany, it's especially bad because we don't have to, it's good we don't have to pay for education, but it makes some people just be long-term students, But education, we usually have information, and we put this in as a statistical covariate. So the findings that I'm presenting are controlling for differences in education. So that wouldn't, I'm not saying it doesn't play a role, but in this data specifically, it didn't. The data you saw today are from a highly selected group of older and younger individuals. And that is really a downside of a lot of the research when you do it kind of in a lab context. Who participates in these research studies? It's not everyone. It's hard to reach more diverse, maybe less educated groups. Do this research in Gainesville. The older adults are almost all somehow affiliated with the university previously or whatever. So you get a very high-functioning, highly selected, we call it, highly selective group of older individuals. That's yes, and that's why I think this grant I was mentioning, I'm really excited that we got the funding, because at least a little bit we will be able to look into a less skewed population, a more diverse, more just more less homogeneous type of population. Did I cover pretty much everything you asked? Yeah. Yeah, and I mean cultural experience. This is a study we did in the US, might look different somewhere else, you know. And the specific deceptive scenarios you'll be confronted with in another country will be different, what you've learned about them previously. And expertise, experience, I think they matter. And in the new grant, actually, it's in this one here, it's going to be one of the specific, there's 3 components here, and one is actually going to specifically look at how much does prior experience help. But yeah.
Oh my goodness. I might just throw it over to you. I thank you and then you.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. And if anybody's interested in learning about different scams, there's a YouTuber called Scammer Payback. Do you follow that?
No, but
No.
I should probably.
Scammer
Sounds like it.
Payback, and the gentleman's name is Pierogi.
Okay.
He goes by that because he's secretive and the scammers in India want to kill him. So if you go on YouTube and look for Scammer Payback, he's a young man with blue hair, and he explains these and helps you to understand how scammers work and how they get into your head. It's wonderful. Scammer Payback.
Thank you. And I really think this kind of information, I mean, you have to be, of course, you know, you can't take any, advice from anyone, but like if it's like a reputable and reliable source, it's worth checking it out for sure, because there are certain schemes that are more likely to come your way than others, right? There are some top scams, and the chance of getting one of those, if you already know, then the first, most typical 10 wouldn't be a problem for you because you already know how to respond to them, not to respond to them. Yeah.
What was your non-inclusion criteria in your studies?
Non-inclusion, so exclusion, inclusion. In that, typically for us, we don't include individuals. I mean, they have to be of a certain age. We don't include individuals with severe chronic disease, like if they really undergo very intense training or treatment, because also there's often medication involved that changes cognition, so certain medications we exclude. We also, in that original study that I showed you and in the ongoing one, we're not including people with cognitive decline. So there are screeners we do, and if you score below a certain score, we are not including in that study. But for example, in the one with the MCI, mild cognitive impairment, that would actually be an inclusion criteria. So it varies a little bit by study. But again, going back to this highly selective group of older individuals that you saw in the data that I presented today. So cognition would, for example, be screened out. Also something like major depression or, some major psychiatric illness, disorder.
Okay, we'll take one more question right here.
I think I have a whole book of questions.
You write it, and then you send it, and I write back.
I spent my career in being a I was a nurse, and then into risk management, all these kinds of things. And I've watched these things happen in the seniors that I worked with. Even my mother had cognitive problems, which was actually diagnosed by Alzheimer's later on. Now, what are we going to do to get this resolved? I'm now an elder, obviously. You know that. And so I'd like to see something happen so that our young people don't have to see their parents go into this thing where they're in the 70s, and they're walking in their own yard, and they just keep walking in the same spot. How is there anything being done for cognitive, or I'll just say Alzheimer's, to get it treated? Or why is it called? I have one friend, and I'll tell you this and let you go. She does have it now. She's a professional, high level, and the front part of her brain is totally white. So that's what I'm after. When are we going to get some studies that can be applied to us? And you too.
Yeah. So there's probably not just one book that could be written in answer to this, and it would take many, many experts to even just update on the current status of, because this is like a broader question, right? It's really, is Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, is it fully treatable? It's clearly highly correlated with greater age, higher age. So the older we get, the more likely we experience cognitive decline into pathology. When we all died with the age of 40, it just wasn't as prominent as now. So it's something that was not naturally selected for, if you will, right? There was no interest. Nature didn't have an interest in filtering this out. We are not reproducing anymore at that age. So it's actually the ApoE allele, 4 allele that I mentioned earlier. In certain populations, it's a beneficial allele to have. It helps with fat intake and metabolism in very scarce societies where they don't have a lot of food. It helps with survival. So in some, in some folks, it was selected for because it's beneficial in young age, and then in old age it becomes non-beneficial. But that was not the interest nature had, to first. So I'm sort of circumventing a little bit, giving you an answer because I don't know the answer to this. I think at this point we know a lot more about these dementia and Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia than we did many years ago. We learn something new every day. Is it preventable? At this point, it's not. It's a progressive disease. Can we try to detect it as early as possible? Absolutely, and we should, because the earlier we detect, the maybe longer we can prolong before it's starting to decline, the more help we can bring in to compensate. So it's a very important and very complex topic. And I think by studying things like that, not only in healthy individuals, but also in people with mild cognitive impairment, and trying to come up with tests that maybe, like the PEST test I told you about, that maybe catches real-world decision-making problems in people with cognitive, not so great trajectories, and identifying them early and giving them the help is I'm not treating it, I'm not healing anything with it, but everyone's trying to do a piece of the work to understand this sad phenomenon better and trying to do something, but there's no cure for it yet at this point.
I would direct you, just if you can, because a lot of research has been done through IHMC and a variety of different doctors and universities and some researchers. If you go to our podcast, which is called STEM Talk, and if you also go to our website, you can find every lecture that has been done here and there's a lot of information there that might help you to understand more about the research, because there's a lot of information on cognitive, Alzheimer's, dementia, diet, metabolic work, everything that can, and some of the potential preventative measures that can be taken, possibly.
Yeah.
Right? Correct? Yeah.
But staying cognitive active and physically active
yes.
are really good things for not just avoiding cognitive, or not avoiding, but slowing cognitive decline, but also all sorts of other diseases. These are two good lifestyle factors that are under our control, and we should probably engage in.
Not a question, but the resource you're looking for, if you look up the Marcus Bandman lecture from earlier in this, or from last season,
May,
he addressed that
exact question.
Mm-hmm.
So
the May 19th lecture.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So you all, thank you so much. And if you look at your